In the high plains of Wyoming, in the summer of 1957, people started talking about Earl Sutton. They weren't talking about his crops or his cattle. They were talking about the hole he was digging on a south-facing slope of a low hill on his property. Sutton wasn't building a house up. He was digging one down. Every day, passers-by on the county road saw the same strange sight. A man with a shovel and a borrowed scraper, slowly carving a massive rectangular wound into the earth. The pile of dirt grew larger than a small barn. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. They'd stop their trucks, watch for a minute, and shake their heads. Building a root cellar, one would say to the other, a mighty big one. But as the summer wore on, it became clear this wasn't for potatoes. This was meant to be his home. The community reaction went from confusion to concern, then to quiet ridicule. They thought he was crazy, or broke, or both. And when the brutal winter of 1958 hit, the kind of winter that breaks thermometers and spirits, that crazy hole in the ground would prove the difference between survival and surrender. If you want to hear the number, the exact temperature that made the county's best builders go silent, stay until the end. What did this quiet, unassuming veteran understand about the earth, about heat, and about the wind that every expert in the Laramie Valley had missed for 100 years? If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Earl Sutton wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. He was a 38-year-old former combat engineer, a man who'd seen enough of the Korean winter to last a lifetime. He'd come to Wyoming with his wife, Margaret, and their two young daughters, Clara and Rose, seeking quiet and space. He bought a section of land that was mostly wind and sky, and the first thing he did was build a house. By the standards of the day, it was a good one, a solid, chinked log cabin with a stone foundation and a tight roof. He built it the way everyone else did, the way Calvin Drecker, who owned the sawmill, told him to. It was respectable, it was conventional, and in its first winter, it was brutally, punishingly cold. That winter of '56 taught Earl a lesson he'd never forget. The temperature dropped to 20 below and stayed there. The wind, a constant physical presence on the high plains, never stopped. It screamed across the flats, scouring every surface, searching for any crack or seam. Earl burned through 5 cords of wood before February. He was up every 3 hours at night, feeding the stove, but it was like trying to warm up the whole outdoors. The cold was a thief. It stole sleep. It stole comfort. It stole dignity. His daughters slept in their coats, huddled under piles of blankets. Margaret spent every evening stuffing rags along the baseboards and window frames, only to find them frozen stiff by morning. Frost bloomed on the nail-heads inside the walls. A glass of water left on the table overnight would have a skin of ice on it by dawn. The cabin never got above 50 degrees, and on the worst nights it hovered in the high 30s. This wasn't living. It was a low-grade state of emergency that lasted for 5 months. Through it all, Earl watched and thought. He was an engineer by training, a man who understood systems, and he saw that the house wasn't failing because it was poorly built. It was failing because the design was wrong for the environment. The problem wasn't just the cold, it was the wind. He explained it to Margaret one night, his voice low over the sound of the gale outside. "Wind doesn't just chill the air," he said. "It strips heat directly from the walls. It's called convective heat loss. Every square foot of that wood is a radiator working in reverse. We're not just fighting the temperature, we're fighting a force that's physically pulling the warmth out of our house, second by second. That thought nagged at him. Then another memory surfaced, a memory from the war. He remembered the bunkers he'd helped build near the 38th parallel, dug into the frozen Korean hillsides. Outside, the winter was savage, every bit as cold as Wyoming. But inside those earth-sheltered bunkers, the temperature was stable. It was never warm, but it was never lethally cold. The earth, he realized, acted as a massive insulator. The ground temperature, 10 feet down, stays remarkably consistent year-round. It doesn't care if there's a blizzard on the surface. The insight hit him with the force of a revelation. Everyone in Wyoming was building their houses like forts, designed to stand up against the wind. They were fighting a battle they could never win. What if you didn't fight the wind? What if you simply got out of its way? His plan formed, simple and radical. He wouldn't build on the land. He would build in the land. He'd use the hill itself as 3 of his walls and his roof. He would excavate a space from the south-facing slope, build a single facade facing the sun, and let the great thermal mass of the planet be his insulation. The wind would blow right over the top, never even knowing the house was there. He wasn't just building a shelter. He was borrowing the stability of the earth itself. The opportunity came that spring. He found a farmer selling off an old pull scraper for next to nothing. The work began. The build was an act of pure, relentless labor. Earl sourced his materials with an engineer's thrift. The bulk of the house, the insulation, the structure, was the hill itself. That was free. For the foundation and the retaining walls, he used stone he cleared from his own fields. He bought a few dozen bags of cement, but that was the biggest expense. The heavy beams needed for the roof structure were salvaged from a dismantled railroad trestle he'd heard about 20 miles away. He traded a week's labor for the right to haul them off. The construction sequence was slow and deliberate, a one-man war against a hillside. First came the excavation. For 2 months, from sunup to sundown, he drove the scraper, pulled by his old tractor, biting into the slope. When the tractor couldn't manage, he used a shovel and a wheelbarrow. He was moving tons of earth, reshaping the landscape one shovelful at a time. The hole grew, a perfect rectangle cut into the golden grass and dark soil, about 40 feet wide and 30 feet deep. Once the space was carved out, he addressed the single biggest challenge his future critics would raise: water. An earth-sheltered home could easily become a damp, moldy tomb. Earl knew this. He spent a week laying a deep 6-inch bed of coarse gravel across the entire floor, running perforated drainage pipes through it that daylighted far down the slope. Water, he reasoned, would always follow the path of least resistance. He was giving it an easy way out. Then came the walls. He built the 2 side walls and the back wall directly against the excavated earth, using thick stone and mortar construction. They weren't just holding back the soil. They were designed to conduct the earth's stable temperature into the living space. The front of the house, the only part exposed to the elements, was a masterpiece of passive solar design before the term even existed. It was a thick stone wall with 2 large south-facing windows. He knew the low winter sun would stream through those windows, warming the stone floor and walls, and that heat would be stored and released slowly overnight. Now, Here's what made the structure truly brilliant: the roof. This wasn't a conventional roof. He laid massive 18-inch thick salvaged timbers across the stone walls with heavy planking on top. Over the planking, he layered thick sheets of tar paper, meticulously overlapping and sealing every seam. This was his waterproof membrane, his shield against the moisture from above. But he didn't stop there. On top of the tar paper, he carefully replaced the earth he had excavated, tamping it down. First a layer of subsoil, then the rich topsoil, and, finally, he laid the original prairie sod back in place. He was tucking his house back into the landscape, pulling the earth over it like a blanket. From above, it would be almost invisible. All this mass and sealing created another problem: ventilation. A house this airtight needed to breathe. Earl engineered a clever solution. He installed a fresh air intake pipe that ran underground and came up near the wood stove. As the stove drew air for combustion, it would pull fresh, pre-warmed air from outside. For exhaust, a well-insulated chimney pipe rose through the sod roof, creating a natural convective loop. It was a simple, elegant system to keep the air fresh and control humidity. It was like the dead air in a double-pane window, but on the scale of a house. The earth was one pane, the interior air the gap, and the stone walls the other pane. The work was punctuated by small human moments. Margaret would walk up the hill with a jar of cold water, her expression a mixture of faith and deep worry. "Are you sure about this, Earl?" she'd ask quietly. He'd just nod, wipe the sweat from his brow, and say, "It'll be warm, Maggie. That's the one thing I'm sure of." Neighbors would slow their trucks on the road below, pointing, talking amongst themselves. Calvin Dreeker, the sawmill owner, drove past one afternoon, stopped his truck, and just stared for a full 5 minutes, a deep frown on his face. He never got out. He just shook his head and drove away. As autumn approached and the first cold winds began to whisper down from the mountains, Earl was finishing the interior. The total cost in materials was staggering in its modesty. The salvage beams were free. The stone was free. His labor was free. His total cash outlay was just under $180 for the cement, the tar paper, the window glass, and the chimney pipe. When it was finally done, it was hard to describe. From the road, it barely looked like a house at all. It was just a stone facade set into the hill with 2 windows and a door, and a low, grass-covered mound rising behind it. A single stovepipe stuck out of the sod roof. It looked more like a well-kept bunker or a hobbit hole than a family home. That evening, as they moved the last of their furniture in, Margaret stood at the door, looking out at the valley. "Earl," she said, her voice heavy with apprehension, "people are going to think we've lost our minds. They'll say we're living in a cave." Earl came and stood beside her, putting an arm around her shoulder. The inside was already noticeably calmer, quieter, the wind a distant murmur instead of a constant assault. He looked at her. "Let them," he said. "We'll be warm." The ridicule started before the first snow fell. It wasn't loud or aggressive at first. It was a low hum of gossip, of head-shaking pity for the poor Sutton family and their strange, dirt-roofed house. But as the weather turned colder, the talk grew more pointed. The first direct confrontation came from Calvin Dreeker. He considered himself the valley's foremost authority on construction, a man who had built half the cabins in the county. He drove up to Earl's place one Saturday in October, his face set with grim purpose. He didn't come to mock. He came to warn, as one professional to another. He walked around the structure, kicking at the sod edge of the roof, peering at the stone facade. "Earl," he began, his voice gravelly, "I respect a man's right to build his own way. But this is it's wrong. You're inviting disaster." He pointed a thick finger at the roofline. "You'll have condensation dripping from your ceiling by Christmas. All that warm, moist air inside hitting the cold earth above, and the weight. Good Lord, the weight of that soil when it gets wet with snowmelt. It will collapse your roof by spring. This isn't a house, Earl. It's a trap." Earl listened patiently, his hands in his pockets. He didn't argue about his drainage system or his ventilation shafts. He didn't try to explain thermal mass. He just gave a slight nod. "Just trying something different, Calvin," was all he said. Drecker left fuming, convinced he'd just warned a man who was too stubborn to be saved. The public mockery was crueler. At the trading post a week later, a loud-mouthed ranch hand named Gus held court by the stove. He'd seen Earl loading supplies and waited until he was just out of earshot. "Sutton's not building a house. He's digging his own grave," Gus boomed, loud enough for everyone to hear. "At least he'll save the county the trouble come spring." A few men laughed uneasily. The nickname stuck. To some, Earl Sutton was now the gravedigger. The gossip network was merciless. At church, women would cast pitying glances at Margaret and her daughters. Conversations would halt when she approached, then resume in whispers when she passed. People would take the long road home from town just to drive by the Sutton place, to stare at the prairie mole's den and wonder at the foolishness of it all. Margaret bore the brunt of this social pressure. At a quilting circle, another homesteader's wife, meaning to be kind, patted her hand. "Dear," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "I do hope you have enough wool blankets for the winter. It must be terribly damp in that place." Margaret felt her face burn, but she just smiled tightly and said, "We're managing, thank you." Then came the official concern. Mr. Abernathy, the county extension agent, paid a visit. He was a man who lived by the book, and the book said nothing about living underground. He was polite but firm, holding a clipboard like a shield. "Mr. Sutton," he said, avoiding eye contact with the house itself. "I've got bulletins here from the University of Wyoming, from Cornell, from the USDA, all on proper farmstead construction for this climate. None of them mention this. My concern is for your family's health. Air quality, mold, structural integrity. This is highly unorthodox." The cut that went deepest, however, came from family. Margaret's brother, Thomas, drove out from the relative comfort of Laramie. He was a man who cared deeply about appearances. He took Earl aside, his face etched with worry and embarrassment. "Earl, I'm saying this for Margaret's sake. People are talking in town. They think you're either scared of the wind or you don't know how to build a proper house, maybe both. It's making your family look foolish." Earl's response was, as always, quiet and level. He looked past Thomas toward the mountains where the sky was turning a hard, wintry gray. "I'm not trying to impress anyone, Thomas," he said. "I'm trying to keep my family warm." By November, the consensus was set. Not one person in the valley, apart from the 2 adults and 2 children who lived there, thought Earl Sutton had solved anything. They thought he'd built a monument to his own stubborn pride, a damp, dark hole that would be a miserable failure. They were waiting for the winter to prove them right. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Earl Sutton right. It changed how people in that part of the world thought about survival itself. Then December came, and it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1958-59 is still recorded in Wyoming's climatology archives as one of the most severe of the 20th century. It wasn't just a cold snap, it was a siege. The escalation was relentless, a daily tightening of winter's grip. December 10th, the thermometer at the trading post read minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. A week later, December 17th, it plunged to minus 34. On the winter solstice, December 21st, the bottom fell out. The official reading was minus 41 degrees, with a wind that gusted to 50 miles per hour, driving the wind chill to a number that was purely academic, something below minus 80, a number that could freeze exposed skin in under a minute. And it did not let up. For 31 consecutive days, from the middle of December to the middle of January, the thermometer in the valley never once climbed above zero. The snow fell, and the wind sculpted it into drifts as hard as concrete, burying fences and blocking roads. The sky was a pale, merciless blue. The sun was a distant, heatless disk. The community began to suffer. This was a cold, beyond normal hardship. This was a threat. The Jensen family, proud owners of a new frame house with big picture windows, burned through their entire winter's supply of wood by New Year's Day. They started burning old fence posts. Their daughter told Margaret's brother in town that they hung blankets over the windows and lived in one room, and the temperature inside never got above 38 degrees. Even the best-built conventional homes were failing. Calvin Drecker, in his own showcase log cabin, had his oil furnace running nonstop, and he was struggling to keep the indoor temperature at 45 degrees. He was burning fuel at a terrifying rate. Gus, the ranch hand who had mocked Earl, had the pipes in his bunkhouse freeze solid and burst, flooding the floor with a sheet of ice. Livestock began to die. Ranchers found cattle frozen solid in the fields, standing up. The daily struggle for survival became all-consuming. Wood piles vanished. Propane tanks ran dry. Families huddled together, feeding their stoves constantly, their entire existence narrowed to the desperate, losing battle against the cold. The wind was a constant screaming predator. And then people started noticing the Sutton place, or rather, they noticed the lack of drama. The county snowplow driver was one of the first. He'd fight his way down their road every few days and see the same thing. A thin, steady, almost lazy plume of smoke rising from the single stovepipe. Not the frantic, billowing smoke of a stove being fed every hour, just a calm, consistent wisp. Then, during a brief lull in the wind, a neighbor driving past saw Earl outside. He was splitting wood for the stove. The temperature was 25 below zero. The neighbor was bundled so tightly only his eyes were visible. Earl Sutton was wearing a flannel shirt, trousers, and work boots. No parka, no heavy coat. He worked at a steady, unhurried pace. It didn't make sense. The windows of the earth-sheltered house glowed with a warm, steady lamplight in the long afternoons. There were no signs of distress, no frantic activity, just a quiet, impossible calm, as if the house existed in a different season from the rest of the world. The valley was in a state of crisis, and the crazy man in the hole in the ground seemed to be the only one who wasn't suffering. The whispers started again, but this time they weren't ridicule. They were tinged with a new, unsettling emotion, pure, baffled curiosity. Stay with me now, because the number that came out of this cabin didn't just surprise the valley. It defied the laws of physics as they understood them. The moment of truth arrived on December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas. The temperature outside was 38 below zero. Calvin Drecker was making an emergency run, delivering firewood to a family whose pile had run out. On his way back, his truck slid on a patch of ice and got stuck in a massive snowdrift, not a quarter-mile from Earl Sutton's place. Cursing the cold and his luck, Calvin bundled up and started walking. He headed for the only shelter in sight, the strange sod-roofed house in the hill. He was walking there for help, but another part of him was driven by a grim, morbid curiosity. He fully expected to find the Suttons in a desperate state, shivering, miserable, their experimental house a frozen failure. He was rehearsing the line he'd use. "All right, Earl, you've had your fun. Now let's get your family to town before they freeze." He knocked on the heavy wooden door. After a moment, it swung open. Margaret Sutton stood there. And the first thing that happened was the warmth. It wasn't a blast of dry furnace heat. It was a deep, steady, radiant warmth that hit him like stepping into a different climate. It felt like a calm autumn afternoon. It was a physical shock. He could feel the brutal cold on his back and this impossible comfort on his face. His eyes adjusted to the lamplight. Margaret was wearing a simple house dress. Behind her, through the opening, Drecker saw the two girls, Clara and Rose. They were sitting at the kitchen table, drawing on pieces of paper. They were wearing light, short-sleeved cotton dresses. Not coats, not sweaters, not even long underwear. Dresses. The image was so profoundly wrong, so completely at odds with the reality of the frozen world outside, that Drecker couldn't process it for a second. He stammered, "Margaret, is everything all right in here?" She smiled a calm, tired smile. "We're fine, Calvin. We're managing just fine. Come in out of that wind before you freeze." He stepped inside, and Earl closed the door behind him. The screaming of the wind vanished, replaced by a profound, tomb-like quiet. The air was fresh and dry. There was no condensation on the windows, no hint of dampness. He looked at Earl, who was in a simple, long-sleeved shirt. "My truck's stuck," Calvin said, his mind still reeling. He gestured vaguely toward the stove. "You keeping that thing fed?" "It's holding steady," Earl said. "We're burning less than a quarter of a cord a week." Calvin stared at him. The words didn't compute. "A quarter of a cord a week?" he repeated, his voice incredulous. "Earl, people are burning a cord a week just to keep from freezing to death. The Jensens are burning fence posts." His eyes scanned the room, looking for the trick, and then he saw it. On the far wall, away from the stove, was a simple wall thermometer. He walked over to it, squinting in the dim light. He leaned in close. The red line of the mercury was sitting clear, steady, and undeniable. It read 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Let that sink in for a moment. 68 degrees. Outside, the wind was howling, and the temperature was 38 below zero. That was a temperature difference of 106 degrees. It was, by every standard of construction Calvin Drecker had ever known, flatly impossible. A log cabin, the best log cabin he could build, might manage a 70-degree differential if you poured fuel into the stove. But 106 degrees on a quarter cord a week? It defied logic. He unbuttoned his parka, feeling sweat begin to prickle on his forehead. He reached out and placed a bare hand on the interior stone wall. It was cool to the touch, but it wasn't cold. It wasn't leaching heat from his body. and it was bone dry. He pulled a small pocket thermometer from his coat, one he used for his work. He held it up. After a few minutes, it settled. It read 67 degrees. He turned back to Earl, his face a mask of disbelief. The numbers, the simple, irrefutable data, laid out the reality in stark terms. The Colby Ranch, burning over a cord a week to hold 40 degrees. The Williams place, burning nearly 2 cords a month to stay at 48. Calvin's own house, the pride of the valley, burning a fortune in fuel oil to maintain 45 degrees. And here, Earl Sutton's hole in the ground, burning scraps of wood and maintaining 68 degrees. The difference wasn't incremental. It was categorical. It wasn't a better house. It was a different kind of idea altogether. Calvin Drecker, a proud, stubborn man who had built his reputation on traditional methods, looked at Earl. He looked at the warm, healthy children drawing at the table. He looked at the sturdy roof beams above his head, holding back the frozen earth. He shook his head slowly, a lifetime of certainty crumbling in the face of one impossible fact. He spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Earl, I've been building houses in this valley for 30 years. He paused and then delivered the final verdict. "We've been doing it wrong." This wasn't just about a number on a thermometer. It was about human dignity. In that little house, winter had been tamed. The girls did their schoolwork without shivering. Margaret cooked meals in a simple apron, not a heavy coat. They slept soundly through the night, under a single blanket, without waking to feed a ravenous fire. Earl Sutton's design hadn't just created a shelter from the storm. It had created a sanctuary. It turned winter from something to be survived into something to be lived through. Word of Calvin Drecker's experience spread through the valley like a slow-moving thaw. In January, after the roads cleared slightly, Mr. Abernathy, the county extension agent, made the trip out. He'd heard the unbelievable stories. He came armed with calibrated instruments, ready to debunk the myth. He measured the indoor and outdoor temperatures. He measured the humidity. He checked the air quality. He logged Earl's meticulous records of wood consumption. And at the end of the day, he packed up his equipment, his face pale with shock. Every impossible number was true. He didn't just confirm the data, he documented a revolution. The vindication wasn't loud. It wasn't triumphant. It was quiet, warm, and irrefutable. It was the simple, undeniable fact of 2 little girls drawing pictures in cotton dresses while a historic blizzard raged outside. After the Great Freeze of '59, the legend of Earl Sutton's soddy grew. It wasn't just a curiosity anymore. It was a proven success. The first to follow his example was a young ranching couple, the Millers. Their small, poorly built cabin had been nearly unlivable during the blizzard. They had been on the verge of giving up and moving back to town. That spring, Tom Miller went to see Earl. He didn't have a hill like Sutton's, but he had a deep ravine on his property. With Earl's advice, Miller spent the summer digging into the ravine bank, building a smaller, simpler version of the earth-sheltered home. He used railroad ties for the front wall and a roof of salvaged corrugated metal covered in tar paper and 2 feet of earth. By the next winter, the Miller family was living in a home that held 65 degrees with minimal fuel, while their old cabin stood nearby, abandoned and filled with snowdrifts. This proved the principle was replicable. The idea began to spread organically, driven by necessity. By the autumn of 1959, 3 more families in the valley were building their own versions of Sutton-style houses. Within 5 years, the low-profile earth-bermed homes with their grass-covered roofs were no longer a strange sight. They were a sign of a smart homesteader, someone who had learned to work with the Wyoming landscape instead of fighting it. Mr. Abernathy, the once skeptical extension agent, became the design's greatest champion. He wrote a detailed bulletin for the Wyoming Extension Service, complete with diagrams, temperature logs from Earl's own records, and construction advice. He titled it, Thermal Mass Construction for High Plains Homesteads. The bulletin was distributed to every county office in the state, and from there it spread. Variations of the design started appearing in the high country of Montana, the wind-swept plains of the Dakotas, and the panhandle of Nebraska. What Earl Sutton had figured out through wartime experience and practical observation, building scientists would later formalize with terms like passive solar, thermal flywheel, and envelope protection. He had, in his own quiet way, anticipated by nearly 2 decades the Earthship and sustainable architecture movements of the 1970s. He was simply ahead of his time. Years later, a young reporter from a Cheyenne newspaper came out to do a story on the now famous man who built his house in a hill. He asked Earl if he felt vindicated, if he enjoyed proving all his critics wrong. Earl, now a graying man content in his quiet life, just gave a small smile and looked at his home, which had settled into the landscape so perfectly it seemed to have grown there. "I wasn't trying to prove a point," he said. "I was trying to keep my girls warm. The earth does the work. It holds the heat in winter and the cool in summer. I just gave it a door." That structure is still there today, nestled into the Wyoming hillside, its sod roof covered in prairie grass that sways in the same wind it was designed to ignore. It stands as a quiet reminder that sometimes the most radical innovations aren't about new technology, but about a deeper understanding of timeless principles. The frontier didn't reward stubbornness or tradition for their own sake. It rewarded what worked. And Earl Sutton's house worked in a way that no one thought possible. Drop a comment and let us know, where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? Subscribe for more stories of quiet competence and forgotten wisdom every week. This video presents a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters and specific events depicted are fictional, created for narrative purposes. However, the engineering principles of earth-sheltered construction and thermal mass are based on real historical and modern building practices used for survival and efficiency in harsh climates.